Hello, my name is Alexander Moore. I'm a fantasy artist and illustrator from Yorkshire in England. I was recently commissioned by my good friends at Which Please Publishing to create some black and white illustrations for their new TTRPG adventure module. It's a funnel for DCC and 5th edition. It's called When the Stars Cried Despair. So I have an extensive working relationship with Which Please, namely Matthew C. Funk. He knows my style well and has selected some parts of the text that he thought my artwork would be able to amplify. I'd like to show you how I created one of these illustrations from start to finish, detailing the process. I'll be discussing my thoughts at the time and since, with the benefit of hindsight. Here is the final picture. It's a full-page illustration titled Paimon at the Gate. Of course, the first step I'll normally take is to study the text itself, which I won't be showing any of that, as it's not really relevant, and I don't think I'm allowed. So I'll move on to the next step, which is the rough sketching process. So here I am working out the composition in Photoshop, using a Cintiq. My practice is ever evolving, and as such I have recently favoured working out the rough sketch digitally. For a while I would use Procreate on my iPad, but as of late I've shifted back into Photoshop, just as a preference. The reason I tend to sketch digitally is that this part of the illustration process feels a lot less like drawing and is in fact much more like arranging. I play with shapes first and then tone. It's about trying to lead the viewer's eye where you want, as well as portraying a compelling narrative. At least that's how I view it. Now, for this illustration, I had a fairly clear visual in my head, thanks to the text being remarkably vivid. Sometimes I'll work on a few different compositions, and discuss that with the client to work out which one to progress with. But this time it didn't really feel like I needed to, as I couldn't really imagine this picture any other way. The text describes a demonic figure in the guise of a nun, with tattooed arms, holding her own head aloft with glowing candlelight in her empty eyes. She stood at the head of a horde of reanimated corpses at the gate of a stockade. All the while a storm rages. Now this is a fairly classic composition in its most basic form. If it's named, I'm unaware, though I've no doubt it will be. It's obviously based around this strong triangular form in the centre and sort of builds up from the bottom. Now, you might have noticed I've done some shifting, resizing and rotating of certain elements in this picture. This is the main reason I like doing the rough sketch digitally, as it is much more forgiving and fluid than with traditional means. Don't get me wrong, my favourite artistic exertion is drawing, specifically with pencil on paper, but I also feel a compulsion to work especially quickly at this stage to capture the fleeting image permanently. It regularly feels as though my hands can't keep up with my brain, and that can really frustrate me, so this is the best workflow for me at this stage of the illustration process. Now I'll begin working in tone. This is an incredibly important part, particularly with this illustration, as I'll be rendering the final image with ink and ink washes. I want this piece to favour atmosphere, mood and drama above all, and tone really is the way to kind of sell that. Some feedback that I would later receive on this rough was regarding the nun's tattoos. Initially, due to the demonic influence on this character, I pictured these evil-looking runes or glyphs carved into her flesh, perhaps as part of some sort of blasphemous ritual. Matt C. Funk informed me that this character was actually once a storied sailor and had tattoos of her many adventures inked on her arms. An excellent character detail, yet admittedly incongruous to the atmosphere and story I was trying to tell with this illustration. For most of the commission work I do, I feel it is best to work purely in favour of the text, as that is our duty as illustrators, to illustrate. However, I felt this time this picture had something extra special and artistic about it that would allow it use outside of its intended setting. That is to say, it would be as much a standalone artwork as it would be an illustration of the subject text. With that in mind, when I developed the drawing further later on, I felt it better to return her sleeves to her arms and add only a hint of the tattoos at her wrist. With just a suggestion of tattoo, I feel the ambiguity serves to satisfy both of our desires on this matter. Yeah, so here is my rough finished. I sent this to Matsi Funk for feedback and the go-ahead to move on to the final stage. And after a few small notes and suggestions, I got a fairly enthusiastic approval, which was excellent. So on to the next step. In Photoshop, I'll remove all the tonal value and just get the basic line work of my rough. Then I'll print that out. In this case, I'll just scale it to fit media, as I don't need the exact scale that I've worked it out at, it's just roughly A4. And then, if it's a little smaller, there's a bit of extra bleed room on the sides when it comes to scanning the final. Now I'll remove the previous sketch that I was working on from the lightbox and tape this new one down. I'm using a watercolour paper here, just some cheap stuff I got off Amazon, I think. Macas A4 300 GSM. Using the lightbox, I'll develop my rough sketch with a bit more detail. I generally don't like using the lightbox as it hurts my precious little eyes, especially if I'm working in the evening, which I most often am. So the sooner I can get it off there, the better, really. Thankfully, it's not an overly complex drawing, so it didn't take too long to move it off. I'll fix it down. I used to move the drawing around a lot, but in recent years I just sort of generally keep it in place. Detailing further, it seems pertinent to mention the changes suggested by Matsi Funk. I had originally either misinterpreted the text or was sent an older draft, but I'd read that the horde of undead soldiers were actually more like mutated freaks with monstrous faces and chimeric features. So in the initial drawing, which is really just a rough guide, I mistakenly portrayed them as such, orcish and ogrin, with the intention of silhouetting various anomalies like scorpion tails, animal horns on the background figures. Yet after discussing with Matsi Funk, we worked out the best reference for these figures would be the Deadites of Evil Dead fame, to interpret them as actual reanimated corpses and victims of demonic possession, with some grotesque, oblique features. Now begins the final inking process. For the nun, I'm using a brush with undiluted ink to draw her. Since I want her to be clearly in the foreground, the bolder lines will make her appear closer and just silhouette her more effectively in comparison to the other figures. Hopefully this way they don't just look like pint-sized sidekicks amassed around her ankles. I was originally inspired to use a brush and ink after thoroughly enjoying the work of Alexis Deakin, particularly his masterwork comic series Gesh, later unfortunately renamed to the much less intriguing Curse of the Chosen. I can't recommend it enough. I'm drawing these figures with the same brush as the nun, I think, but with a finer point and a bit more sort of roughness to it, almost dry brushed. This obscures their detail somewhat, hopefully enhancing their position in the image, as well as reinforcing their more textured, horrific visage. My one regret is filling that figure in completely black. I'm not too sure why I did that, but hopefully it doesn't pull too much focus. The stockade walls and gates are another way to show depth and scale. I felt the straight line from before was a little dull, so I drew a half open or closed gate, call it symbolism. Now the line work is finished, I'll erase the pencil drawing before working in my first few tones in diluted ink. It's at this point that I realise I should have perhaps used masking fluid on the lightning strikes, as I was rather fond of the way I drew them initially, but now they're lost in layers of black. I want this piece to be very dark to really ramp up the atmosphere, and I'll create a lot more contrast with the lightning and rim lights later on. I'll apply an initial mid-tone wash and let it dry. With more layers, I'll emphasise some of those darker shapes and try to create the messy effect of those heavy rolling black clouds. I'll also hold back on the parts that should be lighter, like the nun's cassock or habit. But for the lightest parts, I'll use white paint towards the end. Using ink like this, it's pretty permanent and you can't really undo anything, but you can go over to rectify any mistakes that you make. I didn't want to detail the figures too much, to keep them obscured a little bit in shadow and leave some more monstrous elements somewhat ambiguous. As much as I like to detail the grisly and gruesome, it's my opinion that in the most effective horror, the viewer's imagination can produce much more frightening images. It's best to give the viewer a prod in the right direction and leave for them space to project their own horrors. Then I'll take it in closer, working in the more intimate areas, such as the nun's face, where I want to draw the viewer's eye. I'll apply more drastic contrast with the lighter canvas of her face, deeper shadows, streaming of blood, and dark hair outline the direct horror I'm trying to portray. Now the final step of the physical piece, and arguably the best bit, with white paint, I carve out new lightning strikes in brilliant white. These frame the figure, and along with the pouring rain, I create a more dynamic sense of movement and time in an otherwise fairly static image. Whilst I lament the loss of the original shapes that I drew, I think these ones are pretty excellent substitutes. So much so that I forget how good the originals really were. Now I begin silhouetting the figures with some bright rim light, using a more pure white for the nun to really emphasise her presence. I also paint in the glowing bright eyes of the horde of horrors. I often debate internally whether this light should cover the outline or be on the outside or inside of them. I didn't think too hard in the moment, however, and let fate take its course. I think it's about finished, so I paint in my signature. And here it is. Now I'll scan the piece and open it in Photoshop for some final tweaks. I use this Canon scanner I bought some years ago. It's good enough as far as I know. I scan in colour, about 300 dpi, and I don't really play with any of the settings. In Photoshop, I'll use the perspective crop tool and cut off a pixel or two from the corners. Since it's scanned in colour, I'll apply a hue saturation adjustment layer and drop the saturation all the way down. I like to create a copy of the artwork layer just in case. Then I'll merge the adjustment layer with that one that I just copied. Finally, I'll create a levels adjustment layer and tweak the image a little bit. Sometimes this process might be quite involved, and more often than not I'll need to do some more tone building and create even more contrast or darkness, more detail, and even fix some mistakes at this stage. Fortunately, however, this picture turned out pretty good, and I think I was surprisingly effective with the physical piece. So much so that I didn't need to adjust much at all. I only ramped up the contrast a little bit, whitening the whites and widening the gap between the mid and lower ranges. And there it is, finished. So here's the final artwork. Matt C. Funk loved it, and honestly so do I. It's one of the rare occasions where I feel genuinely satisfied with the piece. Of course, there's always room for improvement, and with each picture I create, I learn more and more. I won't point out any of the flaws this time. If you want to see the picture in situ, then please check out When the Stars Cried Despair. I have some more artwork in there, and it's a really cool funnel module with some great ideas. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.